children, Chaya Lamm Warburg, Joshua Lamm, Shalom Lamm, myself, Mark Dratch, grandchildren, Tova Warburg Sinensky, Daniel Lamm, Rabbi Dr. Ari Lamm, Yali Dratch, and nephew Ari Goldman. We'll conclude with a mole that will be recited by Cantor Chaim David Berzon. Andy.
Okay. Ashrei ha'ish asher lo halach be'atzat risha'im u'v'derech chata'im lo amad u'v'moshav leitzim lo yashav ki im b'torat Adonai cheftzo u'v'torato yehegeh yomam v'layla v'haya ke'etz shatul al polgei mayim asher piryo yitain bi'ito ve'alehu lo yibol v'chol asher ya'aseh yatzliach lo chen harisha'im ki im kamotz asher tidefenu ruach al kein lo yakumu risha'im ba'mishpat v'chata'im ba'adat tzadikim ki yodea Adonai derech tzadikim v'derech risha'im toved.
Rabbi Berman.
Today is a solemn and sad day for all of us. We have lost a leader and a legend, a friend, and a father. Rabbi Dr. Norman Lamm's myriad achievements are well known and documented. His profound love to his wife and life partner, Mindy, his enormous pride and dedication to his family will be addressed by others here today. In my brief remarks, I will not attempt the impossible to capture the full expanse of his sterling character and astounding brilliance, but rather hope to flesh out two distinct elements of his rich personality that distinguished him and contributed to his vast accomplishments. It was my Chag HaSmicha, the day that the yeshiva celebrates its recent rabbinic graduates, and I was sitting on the stage as my class representative in front of a packed Lamport auditorium. Delivering the keynote address to a spellbound audience was Rabbi Dr. Norman Lamm, president and Rosh HaYeshiva of Yeshiva University. Sitting next to me was Rabbi Haskell Lookstein, who was tapping his feet to the rhythm of Rabbi Lamm's remarks. And I thought to myself that with the thousands of people present in the room today, that I was one of the few who truly understood what was happening at this moment. For in my years studying under Rabbi Lamm had initiated me into the small community of rabbinic artists. My story with Rabbi Lamm began when I was 24. I, of course, knew of Rabbi Lamm and read his works throughout my life, growing up in a Yeshiva University family. But I really didn't get to know him until I was 24. At 24, I began my tenure at the Jewish Center as rabbinic intern. And while I had anticipated learning much from its esteemed rabbi, who has since become my Rebbe, Rabbi Jacob J. Schachter, it was an unexpected blessing to forge a deep and personal student-teacher relationship with Rabbi Lamm. It started with a minor request. After delivering my first sermon at the Jewish Center, I asked Rabbi Lamm for his feedback. I didn't realize he would agree. And he gave me his feedback. And he continued to give me his feedback. Years and years afterwards, we met after every sermon or public presentation that I delivered. It was extraordinary. Rabbi Lamm was the premier expositor of our community's worldview. He was the most articulate, eloquent, compelling speaker in the Jewish world. His teachings and writings anchored modern life in Torah values and taught us how we can grow from the interchange of history's great ideas. And I had him to myself for hours. We would meet in his office at YU or in his apartment, and he would impart to me his Torah and life lessons. The context of the discussion would be to review my speeches. I remember once when we met that he was having trouble remembering the content of my last speech. So I remarked that it must not have been so good. And he said, no, it wasn't the content that was the problem. It was the opening joke. It was too good. It was too funny. Thinking back on the speech is all that I can remember of it, he said. You need to calibrate your humor. It's not about getting a laugh, but the right laugh at the right time and at the right measure. You see, for Rabbi Lamm, the speech was a work of art. Every word was selected. Every moment was chosen. Rabbi Lamm was a rabbinic artist, and he lifted the veil to show me how the magic was made. He gave me a reading list. He suggested Sfarim to study, and he taught me about form and content. I remember sitting in his apartment when he instructed me about cadence and rhythm. There's a subconscious element to an excellent speech, he said. There is music and a beat. There's a moment to rise, to fluctuate, to crescendo, and to descend. I sat there stunned. Rabbi Lamm's mastery was otherworldly. Everyone loved his talks, but they didn't truly understand why. He was playing in another dimension that people didn't even know existed. Rabbi Lamm was an artist, but he wasn't simply an artist. He was also an architect. His vast intellect and penetrating scholarship, bringing together sources from all fields of knowledge, wove together to create a tapestry that shaped the very way we experience life in modern times. The ideas he invented, the concepts he clarified, the phrases he coined became part of the Jewish landscape and lexicon of the day. Spiritual dignity, sensuous orthodoxy and moderation, synthesis, and Torah U'Madda. He created the Jewish conceptual, spiritual, and moral scaffolding that enabled our community to succeed and thrive as Torah Jews in the modern era. But his architecture was not just conceptual. And this brings us to Yeshiva University. Rabbi Lamm defined the presidency of Yeshiva University. For at its core, Yeshiva University is an idea. It's an idea about integration, about bringing our values out into the world, about serving God. It's an idea that he cherished and embellished, that shone and flourished under his direction. He transformed our institution into his canvas, perpetuating and institutionalizing his artistic vision, which inspired great philanthropists to donate their resources, great rabbis and academicians to partner in the project, and generations upon generations of students to be shaped by his values and ideals. The teacher, the poet, the man of words is not often the institution builder, the educational visionary, and the man of action. It is the rare artist who is also an architect. Samuel Taylor Coleridge famously said that the principle of Gothic architecture is infinity made imaginable. This is what Rabbi Lamm did for us. He translated the infinity, the Torah, wisdom, truth, into the imaginable, in terms and concepts and ideas we can understand and appreciate, and into institutions and communities that would perpetuate them. Rabbi Lamm's due role as artist and architect is best captured in the image of Jacob's ladder. V'hinei sulam mutzav arza, v'rosho magia hashamayma, v'hinei malachei Elokim olim v'yordim bo. Jacob dreamed of a ladder rooted in the ground, ascending to the heights of heaven, with the angels rising and descending. Rabbi Lamm was our angel. As an artist, he inspired us to soar to the heavens. As an architect, he brought heaven down to us. Rabbi Lamm, Rabbi. Today is yesterday. We continue to tap along to the rhythm and cadence of your wisdom and leadership. Now sitting in the chair you once occupied and better understanding the responsibilities you shouldered, I have an even greater appreciation for your grace and elegance, for your enormous achievements, and for the model you set for President Richard Joel and me to follow. Your memory and example will always animate our Yeshiva University community. Thank you, Rabbi, for carving out time in your incredibly packed schedule to develop a warm relationship with a young budding rabbi at the start of his career. Thank you for your scholarship, your vision, your leadership, your love. I will always remain your student. We will forever remain your disciples. Yehi zichro baruch.
Rav Shachner. Rav Shachner, you need to unmute. I'm sorry, you need to unmute. I should have unmuted.
Go back to the way you're looking at it. It's good. He's fine now.
You're okay now.
Okay. B'shus Maran of Rabbanan, there's so many things that one could talk about. I'll concentrate on one nekuda. During this epidemic that we just went through, there was the halachic issue of triage. Hundreds of patients came into the hospital every day, and the doctors and the nurses simply couldn't deal with everybody at the same time. They had to decide who gets kedima. So one of the glolim, one of the rules that appears in the Gemara, we couldn't give this over to the public here in America. One of the glolim is that if one of the patients is your father, he takes kedima. If one of the patients is your Rebbe, he takes kedima to the others. What if you have two patients? One is your father, one is your Rebbe. So the Gemara says that the Rebbe takes precedence. The Rebbe takes kedima because the father brings you to Olam Hazeh, and the Rebbe brings you to Olam Haba. And that's more important. So then the Ramah in Shulchan Aruch quotes from the Sefer Hasidim in second chelik, in the third chelik Yeridea, Hilchos Talmud Torah. The Ramah quotes from Sefer Hasidim: if the parents are paying tuition, then the parents are the ones who are seeing to it that the child is educated with Torah. So the parents are mevi'im most of the day Olam Haba. So then the parents take kedima because they brought the child to Olam Hazeh and to Olam Haba. The Shach there in his commentary on the side quotes the rest of the statement of the Sefer Hasidim. What if the parents are not paying tuition and the Rebbe is not teaching for nothing? The Rebbe is salaried, and there's a different person who's paying the tuition. And all three need help. So the one who is paying the Rebbe's salary is considered the one who's Mevil, the Chayehu Olam Haba. Dr. Lamm all the years insisted on preserving the tradition of the yeshiva, that Schar Limud was not charged for Limudei Kodesh. The tuition only covered the secular studies, and the Limudei Kodesh were always free. And he accepted the responsibility upon himself to be like the B'nai Kahas, Noisim Misarim. He's the one who saw to it that all of the salaries were paid. I didn't teach for nothing. I wasn't maybe anybody to Chayehu Olam Haba. It was Dr. Lamm who brought all the thousands and thousands of boys and girls and Rabbeim, everyone who was learning in the Toilel and the Rabbeim and everyone. He was the one who brought everybody to Chayehu Olam Haba. I remember on one occasion there was a group of European Galachim who came to the yeshiva. They had a problem. In Europe, whoever goes to university and takes secular studies doesn't want to go to theological seminary. There's a contradiction. They wanted to know how come in the yeshiva We have secular education, and you have the same classroom. We have Limudei Kodesh. So they invited themselves to the yeshiva. Dr. Lamm had no brera, so they came to the yeshiva. So I remember once they were sitting around a table, and one of them was sitting right opposite Dr. Lamm, and he asks them, how do you run the school? They want to know what the secret to success is. How come by us there's no contradiction between secular education and theological studies? And by them there is. So the first thing Dr. Lamm said is, well, we have a law that just like when Moses was on Mount Sinai, God didn't charge him tuition. So Moses taught the Jewish people, he didn't charge them tuition. And this is the din throughout all the future generations. We don't charge any tuition. So the Galach sitting opposite Dr. Lamm is taking notes, so he writes this down. So then he says, but don't the rabbis get a salary here? How do you pay the salary? So Dr. Lamm said, we have to schnorr money. We have to raise money. He was insistent on preserving this sacred tradition of the yeshiva, not to charge tuition for Limudei Kodesh. This was one of his holiest principles. And he was the one who was maybe all of the Talmidim and all of the Rabbeim, all of the learning was in his chus. There's much more to discuss, but the other speakers will certainly cover much more. Yehi Zichro Baruch.
Rabbi Levine.
What is the measure of a man? If, as I heard Mindy say on more than one occasion, life is a journey, how does one know whether and to what extent the traveler has reached his destination? The Tfilas Haderech, the traveler's prayer, may provide a clue. When he sets off on a trek fraught with peril, the traveler davens to Hashem and he says, "V'sagienu limchos chavtzenu lachayimu l'simcha u'leshalom." Let us, Hashem, let us arrive at our destination in life, in happiness, and in peace. I'm thinking about Morenu Rabbeinu Rabbi Lamm, and particularly in thinking about his 18 years at the Jewish Center. It's these three qualities captured here that come to the fore. Allow me to start at the end with the notion of Shalom, the notion of harmony. Rabbi Lamm was possessed of an extraordinary gift for synthesis. He was a scientist and a poet, a rationalist who read and wrote deeply about Hasidic thought, a scholar and a gentleman, an artist and an architect. By the time you were done listening to his words, the synthesis was obvious. It all fit together so seamlessly. The question wasn't, how did Rabbi Lamm generate this dazzling insight, but rather, why hadn't anyone else noticed this before? It's every shul's dream to find a rabbi who excels both at scholarship and as a pastor. You don't have to like every one of your members, Rabbi Lamm once told me. You don't have to like every one of your members, but you have to love every one of your members. To the cadences of the Jewish Center, he brought Shalom. He brought harmony. He synthesized the two great roles of the rabbi such that he became the preeminent scholar of our era at the same time. He was dispensing compassion to his beloved flock. Second is Simcha. It wasn't just that Rabbi Lamm was warm and filled with joy. His capacity for wit was limitless. When our eldest son Akiva was about 2, he was very comfortable in Hebrew thanks to an Israeli nanny. I was once waiting with him at an elevator. When the doors opened, out walked Rabbi Lamm. Akiva looked up and he pointed and he said, "Ish tzaddik." Without missing a beat, Rabbi Lamm looked down at him and said, "You should tell my wife." He added so much joy to the lives of his congregants and his students. From the moment I came to the Jewish Center as the rabbinic intern, Rabbi Lamm took a keen interest in my personal growth and development. When I would see him over the years at a simcha or a dinner, he would pull me aside and he would introduce me. He would say, "Come, I want to introduce you. I want you to meet my rabbi." He was so generous with his time and his wisdom. As Rabbi Berman so eloquently described, I too was the great beneficiary of Rabbi Lamm's personal mentorship. Whenever I met with him, whether it was in his office or his home, I always emerged feeling elevated and inspired, renewed in my conviction that it was indeed possible to contribute meaningfully to the Jewish people. So much of my rabbinate has been shaped by the lessons he taught me. Finally, Chaim, perhaps the real test of a rabbi is what happens to the relationship he has with his members when he's no longer the rabbi and they are no longer his members. Rabbi Lamm saw his rabbinate as a lifetime vocation. So while the presidency of Yeshiva University took Rabbi Lamm out of the Jewish Center, it could never take the Jewish Center out of Rabbi Lamm. Sitting in the pews, he davened regularly with us on Shabbos. When the walk became too far, he and Mindy would stay across the street to be with us for special occasions and chagim. And in recent years, after the Lambs moved to 88th Street, they were a regular presence once again, all the while remaining deeply connected and involved in the life of our shul. Some years after he became the president of YU, a young woman from the Jewish Center became engaged. She called to ask if Rabbi Lamm would officiate at her wedding. He would love to, he said, but the date presented a conflict. He'd already made a commitment to appear at a conference at the White House. The bride began to make other arrangements. Rabbi Lamm called back a short time later to say that he had moved the date of the conference and he would be happy to officiate. I remember visiting an older couple at the shul on a Friday afternoon when I was the assistant rabbi. While I was there, the phone rang. It was Rabbi Lamm calling to wish them a good Shabbos. And I remember thinking to myself, 1976, it's been 30 years since he's been the rabbi. He's still calling to say good Shabbos. Rabbi Lamm once said of Rabbi Belkin something that applies now. He was blessed with great gifts, both intellectual and personal, and few of us indeed can aspire to equal his achievements, but we can learn from him. Klal Yisrael thought of Rabbi Lamm as the leader of the Jewish people. We at the Jewish Center thought of him as our rabbi. By translating the vocabulary and values of our Masorah into a poetic code of sanctified Jewish living, he blazed an intellectual trail for thousands. He was and remains not just a role model for rabbis the world over, but an icon. Like Yosef seeing Demus Yokno Shel Aviv in Beis Potiphar, when we face our most pressing challenges, when the endpoint seems unreachable, we'll conjure up a visage of Rabbi Lamm. And knowing what he would have done, the path before us will be obvious, and the destination won't seem so distant after all. All of us who were his students are eternally in his debt, for his warmth and his wisdom, his faith and his friendship, his courage and his charisma, his vision and his vitality, his leadership and his love. Tehei nishmaso moreinu v'Rabbeinu Rav Nachum ben Reb Meir Shmuel tzura b'tzura chayim. May the soul of Rabbi Lamm be bound in the bonds of eternal life, and may his soul reach its ultimate destination, l'chayim, u'lesimcha, u'leshalom.
Dr. Shatz.
I want to speak today not about my connection to Rabbi Lamm through YU, but about a different and more personal connection that goes back almost 60 years. These remarks are partly about what Rabbi Lamm means to me, but they also bear on what he meant to world Jewry well before he became president of YU, and on what his labors will mean for generations to come. And as I speak, every fiber of my being is filled with gratitude to him, with hakoras hatov, but also with inexpressible sadness, a sadness that already began with the passing of Mrs. Mandela Lamm alaiha shalom a few weeks ago. Rabbi Ari Berman once wrote about Rabbi Lamm's sermons, the words he spoke changed the lives of our members. Mibesori yechazeh, I can testify to that from my own experience. When I was 13, right after my bar mitzvah, my family moved from the suburbs to the Upper West Side. And my father, Zichrono Livracha, who loved Divrei Torah, said to me, David, I just heard a fantastic speaker. You will love his sermon this Shabbos. Yeah, right, I figured, what 13-year-old would want to pass up a good sermon? Well, guess what? I was blown away, me along with other 13-year-olds and 40-year-olds and 60-year-olds and everyone else. He was mesmerizing. In his hands, to echo Rabbi Berman, the sermon became an art form. Everything about them was fabulous. And over time, his oratory and his writing and his palpable passion for ideas, his joy about ideas, shaped my life. They gave me, like all his listeners and readers, serious exposure to the world of Jewish ideas. And they ultimately made that world my own passion and my own profession. But are the drushos per se so important? And after all, he left the rabbinate in 1976. A lot happened after that, right? Like a second career. But beyond the eloquence and the stunning architecture and the depth, there are things to learn from the drushos about him, and also, as I said, what he meant to world Jewry well before he was president, and about what his labors will mean for generations to come. I'm going to pare down my 6 takeaways to 2. First, his attitude to the work of his hands. Before the sermons were published on the web, Pearl Berger, who was then the Dean of Libraries at Yeshiva University, and the person who initiated the whole project of putting the sermons online, she asked him, aren't you concerned that people will present these as their own without attribution? But he made clear that his objective was simply to share Torah thoughts and to help those who taught Torah, which is one reason why he was so generous in helping people with Divrei Torah, even for the most insignificant occasions. It was like having Winston Churchill's help in crafting a child's show and tell. The second and final takeaway has to do with what Rabbi Lamm called the voice of Torah in the battle of ideas. As YU president, he stressed Torah Umada, the value of general culture for Judaism. But in the sermons and much else in his earlier career, it's the reverse. It's the value of Judaism for general culture, for society. He gave a religious appraisal of world events and movements, and he instilled a confidence that we can state our response and our values eloquently and cogently. When the drushos were to be published, one of the questions that editors faced in the various collections is whether they were dated. I mean, were they frozen in time by references to the Eichmann trial, the space race, Vatican II, the Vietnam War, along with all sorts of minor and long forgotten political hiccups? As it turns out, public reaction was the very opposite, that the first thing people say about the sermon collections is how relevant they are today. After all, he spoke to a Jewish community beset by intermarriage and assimilation and anti-Semitism, to a world community trembling and reeling from horrific brutality, inhumanity, and the prospect of nuclear war. His speeches addressed individuals in search of meaning and purpose and direction. The drusha spoke to parents who must cope with wayward children and to children who endured complex relationships with parents. You'll find examinations of apathy, sadness, fear, shame, self-esteem, loneliness, arrogance, a yearning for privacy, the yearning for community, and as in one sermon, that quintessential Jewish trait, worry. These issues are not going anywhere. They aren't relics. They aren't vestigial organs of some earlier stage of human psychology and human history. They are po imanu hayom. They are the stuff of life. They are the human condition. And his insights are precious and everlasting, reaching, in a phrase that I heard from him, untold generations yet unborn. In a Yizkor drasha, where Rabbi Lamm was perhaps at his most electrifying, he spoke about those who live and those who live on. Rabbi Lamm not merely lived, he lives on in books of halacha, books of machshava, shiurim, addresses on communal issues, countless acts of leadership, and countless small acts, as you've heard, of chesed and kindness and friendship. His messages teach us the power of Judaism to respond to events in any day, a dynamic man and a dynamic Torah. The closing words of Megillas Esther describe Mordechai as Doresh Tov La'amo. In the spirit of Rabbi Lamm's playful puns, I say that Rabbi Norman Lamm was a Doresh Tov, a great darshan, and he did it all le'amo, for the sake of his people and for the sake of Torah. Tehei nishmaso tzurura b'tzror hachayim.
Chaya.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, this is very hard. Daddy, you provided us with a very, very privileged childhood, infused with warmth, humor, Yiddishkeit, industriousness, and intellect. In his dedication to the good society, my father wrote to my children, Chaya, Josh, Shalom, and Sarah, who helped their parents strive to make their home a good society in miniature. Daddy and Mommy, I hope we did you proud in fashioning our lives and homes in the image of yours. It's almost impossible to capture my father's true essence. He was so incredibly multifaceted and impossible to reduce to a few words or qualities. That was one of the things that made him such an exciting father. The earlier speaker spoke of erudition, of scholarship, of world influence. I would like to share some memories, just random thoughts that round out the picture of a more personal qualities, his wit, his humor, his art, his humanity. And it's very fitting that I speak after David Shatz, who really was with us in our family all of these years from the time he was a kid and we were kids. And that friendship lasted till now. And one of the most important things, memorable things about my house was Shabbos, and David Shatz was very much part of Shabbos. My father was warm, sensitive, sweet. He placed his family before all else. He strove his whole life to make his parents proud of him. And some of the most wonderful moments I remember are them watching him earn his doctorate at graduation and his investiture as president of YU. In that vein of warmth, everyone thought they were and wanted to be my father's favorite. Every niece and grandchild would greet him with, "Hi, Uncle Norman, this is your favorite so-and-so." I mean, he gloried in their love. He had tremendous kibbud av v'aim. He lived his life to please his parents, and he treated them with the utmost respect. They were Pashut, plain Jews from Europe, and he was probably the first member of his family to graduate from college and get an advanced degree. And yet his deference to them was incredible. And his and my mother's kibbud av v'aim to both of their parents were something that we tried very, very hard to emulate. My father was, although he was in the public eye, he was fiercely loyal to his family and taught us by example, family first. His chesed to individual family members was legendary, and everybody knew that they could count on Uncle Norman. My cousin Jay shared with me a great story yesterday. Jay's always the first one to call me and said, "I called your father. I was, a college something or other with teenage angst. And I said, Uncle Norman, I have to talk to you." So without a beat, my father invited him upstairs. Jay walks in, and I hope I'm not retelling this wrong. And there's another gentleman there who said, "Mr. Netanyahu would like you to meet my nephew." So no matter who was in his presence, family always came first. My father was extremely approachable. He took tremendous interest in young people. And anyone who sought him out, he really spoke to. We've received dozens and dozens of emails with the same theme. Young person corners my father someplace. My father actually gives that person the time of day and shows tremendous interest in their personal growth and development. Person goes on to have a decades-long correspondence with my father, who ultimately helped shape their career, their life's partner choices, and and brings the grandchildren to visit. That is a story that we have heard over and over, so I guess it must be true. My father was one of the most productive people on the planet. He never spent an idle second. Unfortunately, some of us inherited that restlessness to constantly be productive. He was always writing. He was always working on behalf of the community. And he was tireless in his pursuit of intellectual and other endeavors. I would say nothing epitomized our house as much as Shabbos. We bring, Shabbos davening starts with Lecha Dodi, Likrat Kala, Pnei Shabbat Nekabbalah. And I would say that my father had many numerous panim. And those of you who are privileged to know him on some levels, so some of his panim, and as his children and his grandchildren, his great-grandchildren, were privileged to see other panim. Daddy, I feel like this is the Motzei Shabbos and this is the Havdalah. It's very hard to say goodbye. We bring in the Shabbos with candles and we bring the Shabbos out with candles. And my mother also lit candles when Shabbat was over. And now it's our time to light a candle for you and to hope that you will be a Melitz Yosher for all of us. Love you.
President, Chancellor, Rabbi, Jewish philosopher, author, editor, leader, founder, and orator.
She must have finished.
My father had many roles during his long, productive life, and everyone joining us here today knew my father in one or more of those roles. He made the tapestry of Jewish life rich and meaningful for us, and we took pride in his many successes and accomplishments. But for me, no role, no mission, no undertaking was more important than the fact that this man was my father. The double loss of my lovely and elegant mother and my brilliant, sweet, balanced, and generous father is somewhat offset by the fact that we were doubly blessed in having them raise and mold us. In the very limited time that I have, I'd like to tell you two brief stories about my father and me. The first is rather common and mundane, and no doubt tells of an experience that most people listening have also had with their own fathers. The second is somewhat more unique. The first helped the little 7-year-old boy develop confidence and trust. The second helped the young man hopefully develop wisdom and judgment. I spent a good part of my young childhood in my head. I developed the habit that when deep in thought, I would pace. My parents began to worry about me when I would wander the house and go from room to room to room whenever anything was on my mind. They sent me for an evaluation, and the psychologist suggested that perhaps I'd be helped by spending more time with my father alone. Now, at that time, my father was the rabbi of the Jewish Center, a professor of Jewish philosophy with a full teaching load at YU. He was teaching at the 92nd Street Y. He was working on his dissertation for his PhD. He was the editor of Tradition and was writing a few books and numerous articles, and was father to 4 small children. Daddy, as usual, did the right thing, as he always did. And beginning the very next Shabbos morning in February, my father took me on walks around the Central Park Reservoir every Shabbos morning at 7:30 a.m. until we went to shul at 9. That very first walk is one of my earliest very clear memories. It was freezing outside, and my thick gloves were simply not up to the task. After complaining that my hands were cold, he removed one of my gloves and removed one of his own gloves. He enveloped my small, cold hand into his own large, warm, strong hand and folded them both deeply into his pocket. We walked together, no siblings, no Jewish Center, no teaching schedules, no doctorate, nothing but the clean, freezing air, the bright sun, the ice on the water, and the simple elemental joy of walking alone holding my father's warm hand. I don't remember anything that we talked about, but it doesn't matter because I remember everything that I felt. My father never really let go of my hand, and I felt his touch with me always. He was my guide and always pointed the way. His hands would lift me up when I was down and give me a happy slap on the back when he was proud and pleased. He would push me when I needed to be pushed, and he pulled me along with him when he wanted to share in the discovery of some Torah or scientific marvel. His was the firm handshake that one day made me feel like a man. He hugged me at my happiest moments, and he held me at my worst. His hands were open in generosity and became soft and silky smooth when he held a new grandchild. I have always been serenely conscious of my father's gentle hold on me. I have felt his lingering presence always, as I do at this very moment. My second story is one of wise parental restraint. The year was 1986, and I was in my third year of medical school, the year when decisions about specialties and residencies are made. After a lifetime of wanting to be a pediatrician, I decided to go into psychiatry instead, and I was not all that sure how this news would be taken by my mother and father. To my great relief, my parents were very supportive and encouraging. My father, though, was particularly delighted with my choice. He took me aside and revealed to me a secret that he had been guarding for 25 years. He told me that when he was a chemistry student at YU and later on at Brooklyn Polytech, he strongly considered applying to medical school. I was floored. I had been interested in medicine since I was 5 years old, and I had never heard anything about this before, but he wasn't yet finished. My father further explained that had he indeed gone to medical school and become a physician, the only specialty that he ever would have considered was psychiatry. Why, I asked him, have you never told me this before? He explained that in raising us, it was very important for him to teach us that no matter what we do with our lives, we had to be moral, to work hard, and be shomer Torah mitzvahs. But he never wanted to influence my professional or career decisions. Encouraging me to take this path or that, he felt, would have injected himself into the decision process that should be owned fully by me. He was aware of the power and influence parents have on their children's decisions, and probably realized through his work with congregants, as I was later to realize in my own work with patients, the danger of parents living their lives vicariously through their children. He kept this a secret from me for a quarter of a century. I was struck at that moment at how my father's simple act of commission was a selfless and wise affirmative act of love and respect from a father to his son. The way my father held my hand and embraced me is the way he held and embraced the entire Jewish community. Whom amongst us has never felt my father's hand at your back, encouraging and guiding you? Who here has not benefited and learned from his delicate, warm, and well-calibrated touch? My father has a legion of people, too numerous to count, who consider him a surrogate father, or a second father, or a spiritual or intellectual father. You have all felt his gentle counsel and caress. And who amongst you do not feel as I do, that he raised you with wisdom, self-restraint, humility, balance, with his strong delicacy and his brilliant stirring oratory. In those very terrible days since COVID-19 snatched away my mother, my father was never really the same. They were married for 67 years and were very much in love with each other. Although unable to fully articulate it, I know that he sensed that an important part of himself was gone. He could no longer hold my mother's hands. After a lifetime of my mother being at my father's side and following him, he could not bear to be without her, so he resolved to stand by her side once again and to follow her. Visiting my father became dangerous to both him and us due to the virus, so since the month of March, when we visited, we had to be distant and could not touch him. He sensed the importance of this somehow and made no move to hold hands or to hug or to kiss. Last week was the last time I saw my father before he lost consciousness. He didn't talk, was very pensive, and seemed so very far away. But just before I left, he slowly opened his hands and his eyes beckoned me forward. And for the final time, I put my small hands into his large, warm, strong hands, and I knew the circle had been closed. Biyado of Kid Ruchi, Dad, It's now time to let you go and to put you into the hands of the Almighty.
My name is Shalom Lamm, and I am the third child. Many of you know much about my remarkable father. What can I, in just a few short minutes, contribute to this montage to give a fuller picture, an insider's view, if you will, of my father? Permit me some reflections that perhaps seem random, but I hope they give a peek, an insight into a window that was our magical upbringing. I think love is the all-encompassing word that permeated our home. I don't mean that in the vague, flighty sort of way. I mean it in a concrete approach to life. My father said many times that he was not certain that Moshe Rabbeinu liked the Jewish people, but he was certain that he loved the Jewish people. Not everyone is always likable. But as a general approach, our home was filled with the love of the Jewish people, a love of our destiny, the mission to be the leaders of ethical monotheism, a love of all people as all being created in God's image, of Torah study, of the arts, of song, of literature. Ours was not a home of cynicism. It was a home of volition, of a can-do spirit, of a must-do spirit. What we saw at home was consistency, what my father preached in public and the way he led at home. Dad had a superhuman capacity for focused work. He slept very, very little. Rather than sleeping for long periods of time at night, he would sleep for only a few hours, and during the day would take these 6 or 10-minute cat naps. We would often hear my father ask my mother, "Min, would you wake me up in 8 minutes?" And he'd be asleep in an instant. And 8 minutes later, Mom would wake him up and he'd be fresh as a daisy and back at work. It's not that he was a workaholic, which I suppose he was. He was rather a man always on a mission. A few times I asked my father what drove him. Why did he never have a wasted minute? And he related that when he was very young, in first grade, in fact, at Torah Vidas, he had a best friend, Joshua Kaufman. Joshua Kaufman died at the end of first grade, and it always haunted him. He was sure he would not live to see his bar mitzvah, that he would not live to be married or have children. He had an underlying anxiety his whole life that he would die before he accomplished his life's purpose. And so he was driven to make each moment count, and he never wasted time. Everything had purpose. He mourned Joshua Kaufman always, but Joshua's untimely death inspired his productive life. And I think he would want Joshua Kaufman to be remembered at this occasion. 1976 was a very busy year. My father gave over 35 major addresses that year. He reflected on America's bicentennial. There was the raid on Entebbe. Dad traveled overseas to deliver a major series of lectures in London. He mused about a religious man occupying the White House in a democracy. There was the resurgence of the PLO, the ethics of charity, addresses on leadership, Judaism and modernity, classes on halacha, Agada, Tanakh, and Talmud. His teaching schedule at YU, his fertile mind was tackling all of these momentous issues in the most insightful and creative ways. And it was during this time in April that his teacher, president of Yeshiva University, Dr. Samuel Belkin, passed away. He knew, of course, that he was on the very short list of those being considered for the presidency of YU in a very troubled time. One can only imagine how overwhelmingly busy a time it was. And yet it was precisely during this whirlwind of intellectual ferment that my father learned that a 15-year-old girl at the Jewish Center, Lori, had stopped coming to shul. Lori had a pet bird in which she lavished great love. She adored that bird, and when the bird died, she was crushed and angry with God. And so she stopped coming to shul. So in the midst of this adult crush of intellectual tumult, Dad focused on Lori and her bird and wrote a magnificent essay to her about life and death and cherishing those things that have a finite existence. How his words ring true today, and particularly on this occasion. Just quoting small snippets of it. We are all mortal creatures. By this, I mean that all that is created must sooner or later come to an end. This holds true not only for birds and animals and flowers, but for human beings as well. It is a sad thought, but it is a fact, and one which we have to learn to live with. For instance, if you knew that you would have a bird forever and ever, you might never take the time to develop warmth towards it, feed it, derive any pleasure from its chirping and singing. It is only because we humans know that everything in life is limited that we make an effort to fill the years we have with light and helpfulness and kindness and goodness. My father ended the essay with, I know, Lori, that losing that bird was a painful experience, but I hope that the explanation I gave you will help you in some way to accept the fact that with less anguish. If the death of that little bird will help you achieve this kind of perspective, then that little bird will itself have made a real contribution to your life, and in that way, it will live on. I've always marveled at the profound words of wisdom sent to a 15-year-old's context. But then when I recently considered all else that was happening in his life, and at that moment, it came to define for me the immense respect and focus my father had for people wherever he found them in their existential struggles. Laurie's bird lives on. At last, a moment I witnessed from nearer the end in May of 2019. My father was really ailing by this time, but my mother was and remained his great champion. My father turned to my mother and said so tenderly, "You're the best thing that ever happened to me. Would you marry me again?" Mom leaned over and kissed him on the forehead and held his hand for a long, long while. What beauty, what tenderness. In the throes of uncertainty and of vulnerability, they just simply adored each other. And so I don't think any of us so very close to my father were really surprised that he followed my mother in death by 46 days. There is something of the romantic, of the poetic in his need to be with his beloved Mandela. Mom and Dad were aristocrats. They were great parents. They were wonderful role models, and they loved us, and they loved the Jewish people, and they loved life. Yehei Zichram Baruch.
And I'm the fourth child. Mark Dratch, the Lamb's daughter, Sarah, Shalom, was my wife for over 30 years. My father-in-law, Norman Lamm, Hareni Kaparat Mishkavo, was a man whose DNA was that of a Galicianer, whose mind was that of a Litvak, whose soul was that of a Chassid, whose mien was that of a scholar, whose pen was that of a poet, whose tongue was that of an orator, and whose heart was that of a Baal Chesed. He had the thick skin necessary to be a man who voiced and stood by sometimes unpopular principles and ideas, personifying the Gemara in Masechah Shabbos, and now Lavim ve'einam olvim, shomim herpasam ve'einam mishivim, usimei ahava usmeichim b'yisurim, alayim hakasuv omer v'yoavav kitseis hashemesh, b'gvuraso. Sages taught about those who are insulted and do not insult, who hear their shame and do not respond, who act out of love and are joyful in suffering. About them, the verse says, and they that love him are as the sun going forth in its might. And he had the soft heart necessary to help thousands, the thousands that he did, family, friends, community members, and strangers, often discreetly and quietly, with advice, financial assistance, connections, a kind word, and encouragement. As you heard, he was a man who never wasted even a second, dedicating himself to learning, reading, thinking, writing, leading, administering, organizing, fundraising, to name just a few of the many activities and responsibilities that he had, and yet who consciously and deliberately made time for students, congregants, widows, and especially family, his children and grandchildren, great-grandchildren, sisters, brother, nieces, and nephews. He was a man who bore the weight of the Jewish world and the burden of the Jewish future on his shoulders, and he bore them responsibly with elegance, grace, and dignity. Generations from now, people will be incredulous when they open his biography and read that all of these traits were possessed and all of these accomplishments were achieved by just one man. In the few moments that I have to speak, I would like to paint a picture of a father-in-law, Rabbi, mentor, confidant, and chavrusa, who I came to know, respect, and love for the past 38 years, as father to my wife, Sarah, Alaa Shalom, whose ready and ceaseless humor and antics often lightened the burdens and worries that he ceaselessly carried. As grandfather to my children, Tova, Bobby, Yali, and Sam, and as my Rebbe and Chavrusa. with whom I learned at least once or twice a week for many years, with whom I discussed and analyzed shilas and community and pastoral issues when I served as a community rabbi, to whom I turned for guidance in matters spiritual and theological and mundane, from whom I learned to speak and write, and from whom I learned to love the New York Times crossword puzzles and Hebrew Scrabble. He often spoke about those who had great influence in his life. Certainly his parents, Sam and Pepi Lamm, Aleim HaShalom, his grandfather, Rabbi Yehoshua Balmo, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, a great Talmid Chacham and Posek, the Rav, Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, Rabbi Dr. Belkin, his predecessor in Rebbe Yeshiva University, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, Rabbi Joseph Balmo, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, the founder of the Crown Heights Yeshiva, Rabbi Joseph Luckstein, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, when he served as an assistant rabbi. And there were many others, too numerous to name at this time. His grandfather, Rabbi Yehoshua Balmo, learned with him from a young age. When Rabbi Lamm was about 10 years old, he and his grandfather were learning a Tosfos in Maseches Pesachim, in which Tosfos cited a Rashi from a different Masechet. The young Rabbi Lamm read the words of the Kuntris and continued to read Tosfos' question. Wait, said his grandfather to him. Do you understand what Rashi is saying? Yes, Zaida, he answered confidently. Does Rashi really say this? The young Rabbi Lamm was confused. Certainly, the Tosfos just quoted Rashi. Rabbi Balmo explained, don't be lazy. Go to the bookshelf and take down the tractate in which that Rashi is found and check it yourself if Tosfos quotes Rashi properly. Know, my child, that faith and trust are the foundational principles of religion. But when you enter the inner sanctum of Talmud Torah, you cannot rely on trust. When you learn, you must doubt. You must be a skeptic, a disbeliever. When the Gemara quotes a brisa, check it. When Tosfos brings a Rashi, look it up. When I, in my own shuvos, cite the Noda B'Yehuda, do not rely on me. Check the sources yourself. Evaluate each svara and question every chiddush. Ask, suspect, check, investigate. And only then do you have a chance that maybe you will learn how to learn. This sense of independence and responsibility prepared the fertile soil of his creative and analytic mind and became the hallmarks of his intellectual and scholarly independence, an independence that expressed itself with great humility and responsibility. When Rabbi Lamm published in Hebrew a collection of his shiurim and Talmudic discourses entitled Halachos v'Halichos, he remarked to me that now he will be able to greet his grandfather and present him with his sefer when he comes to Olam Haba with his head held high, with the knowledge that he had produced something worthwhile. I have a sense that even his grandfather would agree that there is so much more of which he is proud. Rabbi Lamm's life as a student, a rabbi, and as president was intertwined with that of Rabbi Soloveitchik. They would meet often to discuss the affairs of the yeshiva and the Jewish world. In the beginning of his administration, the Rav insisted that he come to Rabbi Lamm's office on the 5th floor of First Hall. After all, Rabbi Lamm was the president. Rabbi Lamm, however, insisted that he come to the Rav's apartment. After all, his Rebbe, from whom he received both his smicha and his PhD, the only student to have that distinction, he should come to him. They compromised and alternated locations for their meetings. Rabbi Lamm was most proud that he introduced advanced Talmud study for women at Stern College, with the Rav delivering the inaugural shiur. He frequently told two stories about his interactions with the Rav. The first occurred when the Rav was teaching Moed Katan in his shiur. He had spent 3 days analyzing and explaining a particular Tosfos, and on the 4th day, the Rav opened the shiur by asking the student, Norman Lamm, to explain that Tosfos, which he did exactly the way the Rav had explained it the day before. The Rav got angry and castigated him. Lamm, he said, I know how I interpreted Tosfos. I don't want to hear what I said. I want to hear what you have to say. If you want to stay in my class, you must think for yourself and not merely parrot what you hear from others, even from me. The next time you come, don't leave your Yetzer Hara outside the classroom. Bring it inside with you. The second episode began in 1958 when he came to the Jewish Center as rabbi. He needed to take a position on the then controversial Eruv in Manhattan. After studying the sugya well, he went to see the Rav in the Greasy Spoon across the street from the main building. To make a very long and very interesting story short, the Rav told him that he, the Rav, was not an expert in the laws of Eruvin, but he sees that Rabbi Lamm is well-versed. If you feel that you have learned the laws properly and are confident in the psak, decide for yourself, the Rav told him. Do not be afraid. I gave you smicha for a reason. Rabbi Lamm supported the use of the Eruv. A number of years later, the Rav came out publicly against the Manhattan Eruv, and Rabbi Lamm returned to him and said, now that my Rebbe has a position on the Eruv, should I reverse my ruling? The Rav repeated what he told him a number of years earlier. If you feel that you have learned the laws properly and are confident in the psak, decide for yourself. Do not be afraid. I gave you smicha for a reason. Rabbi Lamm often cited Rabbi Chaim Volozhner's explanation of the first Mishnah in Pirkei Avos, V'amidu Talmidim Harbe. Rabbi Lamm wrote, Rav Chaim of Volozhin explained that this dictate is not concerned with the quantity of students that a teacher amasses, but with the goal of the education to which a teacher aspires. The verb ha'amidu is in the hifil, causative construct. Hence, a teacher is not exhorted to amass many students, but rather to cause the students he has to stand on their own. Rav Chaim draws a parallel to the same word as is used in the halachic concept of davar hama'amid, a term which derives from the same root in the same grammatical construct. The davar hama'amid is a substance like gelatin or rennet, which when added to a mixture causes it to gel, to become a solid. A teacher's job is to nurture disciples who have the knowledge, skills, and confidence to be independent and creative thinkers. The Rav aspired to have Talmidim, not Hasidim, wrote Rabbi Lamm, challenging, questioning, independent-minded disciples, not fawning, accepting, and unquestioning acolytes. That is why, at the same time that he forced us into systematic thinking and molded our derech, our methodology, he also gave us space, insisting that we think and decide certain halachic questions on our own. He lived this interpretation of the injunction in Pirkei Avos literally. Set up many students. Make a great effort to have your students stand on their own and not be permanently tied to your apron strings. So great was his personal charisma that many of us ended up both as Talmidim and Hasidim. It was this independence, an independence that demands a great deal of constant learning, deliberation, creativity, and responsibility that I observed in his learning, his leadership, and in his decision-making. It was a path that I learned from him. When I had a shaila, he refused to answer it. He expected me to learn the sugya as well, to review the halachic literature, to formulate my own opinion, and to defend it, to be willing to listen and consult with others, and to change my mind when necessary. He had undeserved confidence in me, and so I learned to have confidence in myself. He expected much from me, and I stretched to meet those expectations the best I knew how. He taught me about leadership, once saying, there is nothing wrong with trying and failing. There is everything with failing to try. To me, my father-in-law was a davar ha'ma'amid. He taught me with love and affection how to learn and how to live. He and his wife and my mother-in-law, Shalom, was the davar ha'ma'amid to our family, forming our values, our direction, our sense of mutual love, trust, and responsibility. He was the davar ha'ma'amid for Yeshiva University, championing and explicating Torah Umada, saving it from bankruptcy, expanding its Torah learning and improving its college, and nurturing, inspiring, and guiding its students. He was the Davar HaMa'amid for modern centrist orthodoxy, its most eloquent spokesman and its deepest intellectual, setting many on the path of passionate commitment to uncompromising religious moderation, religious Zionism, community engagement, and new halachically valid opportunities for women. The halacha is clear. A Davar HaMa'amid is never batel. It is never nullified. It never disappears. It exists forever. And so too we pray that the legacy and teaching of our father, grandfather, rabbi, Rosh Yeshiva, and friend, a legacy that causes us to stand tall and proud, that gives meaning, direction, and purpose to our religious and spiritual lives, that causes us and enables us to think and learn, that bids us to stand proud, tall and proud as modern centrist Orthodox Jews, religious Zionists, B'nai Yeshiva University, will never be batel, that it will never cease to encourage us, support us, and give us the ability to stand proud. And finally, Rabbi Lamm himself, in an unpublished autobiography that he wrote for his children and grandchildren, describes what he wants for his family. I'll quote, "I want them to learn from my experience, both positive and negative, to achieve success with grace and to face failure with dignity, to be prepared for the extreme periods of sleep and crying without hubris or despair, and never to stop hoping and expecting better news and better times. Above all, I want them to learn from my narrative the importance of commitment to great and noble ideals, even when it hurts and disappoints, but to trust that ultimately it will all prove worthwhile. I pray that they always strive to live morally upstanding and spiritually fulfilling lives, marked by abiding loyalty to the principles of Orthodox Judaism, to Torah Ummada, along with respect for all people who honestly follow the dictates of their own beliefs and conscience, even when such do not accord with my own deepest commitments, and to combine their love of God and Torah with love of all humans created in the image of God. If in any way my story can encourage in them the aspiration to attain a modicum of wisdom, a trust in the faith of their fathers and ancestors' spiritual strivings from Abraham through Moses to the giants of the sacred Jewish tradition, a measure of the value of the sweetness and intellectual excitement in the study of Torah, a desire to excel in the practice of mitzvot, the reassurance that ultimately character and godliness are infinitely more ennobling and valuable than any worldly goods or social approbation, and the strength to hold fast and persevere in the face of discouragement, discourtesy, disappointment, and disparagement. By then, not only my biography, but my life will have proven worthwhile. Halavai.
I'm Tova. I am Zaida's eldest and one of his favorite grandchildren. Last night, after spending 4 hours writing, only to conclude that what I wrote was wholly insufficient and was certainly not eloquent, and was a document that my grandfather would mark up with hundreds of track changes, I burst into tears and exclaimed to my husband, Tzvi, who I co-opted as my editor in lieu of Zaida, "Too bad I can't give this to Zaida to edit." And maybe that's precisely the point. I can't give this to Zaida to edit, nor would it be possible to edit a description of a life and to arrive at a masterpiece final draft. Because while editing is about the use of language and grammar, as our grandfather taught us, it's fundamentally about perspective taking. It's about looking at someone's ideas and sharing a perspective on what to say and how they say it. And I am limited in perspective, though also extremely blessed. Because while most of the world saw my grandfather as the esteemed and revered Rabbi Dr. Norman Lamm, I have always seen him as Zaida. And therefore, I will never be able to write a final draft of this eulogy because I will need you to help me edit and revise and rethink it over time by sharing your perspective. Shortly before my bat mitzvah, I was invited to 101 Central Park West and summoned to the living room. The living room, capital L, capital R, was rarely used with the exception of special occasions, such as the Lamm family Hanukkah parties. That was the only time that Zaida's heavy wood stender moved from its place due to the overflow of presents, people, and love. I took my position at the stender, which had been pushed next to the piano, and Grandma and Zaida stood a few feet away at the entrance to the room. My instructions were to practice my bat mitzvah speech, which, I'm not going to lie, was written by Zaida, but with words that I actually did understand. I was told to enunciate every word and talk loudly. I was not excited, to put it mildly, and think I almost ran away and certainly refused to practice more than once. But I could tell that public speaking skills, of which I had none, were very important. I knew it wasn't a performance. It wasn't about accruing fans. It was about using the God-given power of speech, a gift that Hashem gave to humans only, as Zaida often shared on Parshat Bereshit, in order to share Torah, wisdom, inspire, and to change people's lives and the world with ideas. Like most of the things that I truly internalized from Zaida, I had never been told this explicitly. He taught us, his doting flock, by doing, not by cajoling or sermonizing or lecturing. To the world, he was Rabbi Lamm, the Rosh Yeshiva and president, a world-class scholar and teacher. To us, he was Zaida, the loving head of Tinokot Shel Beit Lamm. There was no pressure and no didactics, just a Zaida who was available to share his passion for learning, if we wished. He made learning Torah exciting through pop-up events such as Family Learning, co-sponsored by Barton's Candy at the Homework on Pesach, and would learn whatever we wanted, whenever we wanted. In high school, I fell in love with Gemara learning, and in college with philosophy. As a young adult on a quest for meaning, I found that Shatz, coupled with philosophy, was an endless world of wisdom, rife for analysis and synthesis. The jelly beans in the glass jar that resided permanently in their living room were delicious, as were the Entenmann's chocolate cookies dipped in milk that my grandmother stocked. But Brisker Lumdas, Plato, and Aristotle were equally tasty, if not better. And I discovered that while there was a large stock of these delicacies, there was simply an unending supply of Torah, wisdom, passion, and love, perfectly packaged in the form of Zaida. He never questioned my motivations to learn, even though for someone of his generation, it was a novel concept. He just made me feel like a complete insider to the Masorah Club, of which I knew he was a knowledgeable member, but never realized that he was actually a club's president. He would bring home pages and pages of printouts of the YU sperm cell items so he could pre-order for us. He purchased my first mini Shatz for me in Mea Shearim when I was in Migdal Oz in 1999, while I waited outside the store after our attempt at store number 1, when it was a fail, when the owner realized that the Shatz was not for him, but for me. He started the graduate program for Advanced Talmudic Studies, GPAS, which afforded me the opportunity to sit in the Stern College Beit Midrash after I graduated college and learn. Without my knowing or even realizing that he might have something to do with GPAS, since in my eyes, he was my grandfather, not Rabbi Dr. Norman Lamm, his imprimatur of this program was instrumental in leading me toward teaching Gemara and ultimately toward becoming a Yoset Halacha. Only years later did I learn that he had supported and was famously photographed in the Rav's first Gemara shir at Stern College. And only now am I beginning to understand how the inestimable value he placed on the observance of Taharat HaMishpacha and his early support of Nishvat have enabled me to help support others' commitment to this pivotal area of Torah learning and living. As my affinity for learning developed, Zaida used to introduce me as his all-the-time eldest granddaughter and sometimes Chavrusa. I would call him to help me understand the pshat of a Gemara as if it were a royal emergency, and he would extend his royal reach within the hour and explain it as many times as I needed. When I was having challenges finding the perfect chavruta, which I catastrophized to be the absolute end of my spiritual existence and identity, and he of course took me very seriously anyways, I asked him if he'd be my chavruta every day for 3 hours. I believe that was the only time he ever turned down a request to learn, but there was a counteroffer, 3 days a week. After Tzvi and I got married, our learning continued to include him as well. Zaida's esteemed assistant, Gladys, would welcome us to his office on the 5th floor, first hall, after arranging to come at a precisely predetermined time to park in Zaida's parking spot. Throughout high school, college, and GPAC, I either spoke to Zaida or emailed him almost every day. Once I called him in the midst of an emergency level dating crisis, and he had his driver bring him from uptown to Starbucks on 40th and Lex near Stern within 90 minutes to talk. Other times it was the email or phone call, papers due tomorrow, I know it's 10 p.m., can you please edit? In retrospect, I cannot fathom how he ever had time for this. I was only one of the 17 grandchildren who were each clamoring for his undivided attention, which we each received. The years when I can ask Zaida my existential questions about life and learning have passed. I cannot pick his brain for endings or for the perfect title with alliteration that is both intelligent and witty. My children will not have the opportunity to send Zaida a paper that is due in less than 12 hours, needs to be a masterpiece, and requires at least 50 track changes, or in the olden days, rounds of multiple, barely legible, handwritten edits. The last email correspondence of this nature that I can find is from February 15, 2009, regarding the first article I ever submitted to an education journal. The email thread is entitled Completely Edited Masterpiece, and I would imagine titled by him as my editor-in-chief. In the 11th hour, I wrote, still stuck on the ending. If you have any thoughts, I have spent over 20 hours on this paper, Dayedu. To which he replied in purple caps in his witty style, patience. I just sent an ending to you. If you don't like it, it will be the ending of all endings. I did like and usually love the endings that Zaida penned. This ending that Zaida has left us is actually the ending of all endings. And Zaida, I have to tell you, I don't like your ending. But as you taught us, we don't get to write the story. We only get to choose how to live it. And we don't get to write the ending either. So I will, as you wrote, try hard to follow your instructions of patience and accept your ending. I will try to embrace this ending in the way that you would have wanted, as painful as that is, by reading it, accepting it, learning from it, and together with all of you who have learned from my grandfather, attempting the daunting task of writing the next chapter of the Jewish people.
Hello, my name is Daniel Lamm. I'm the son of Josh and Rivki Lamm and the grandson of Dr. Norman Lamm. I called him Zaida. My earliest recollection of Zaida was when he bounced me on his leg and sang me a nursery rhyme called Hoida Hinda. As I got older, I admired how he and my Aunt Bracha played Scrabble together. I was in awe of his vocabulary and that he would use all of his letters to get these amazing high scores. Spelling was never my specialty. I knew that Zaida was a brilliant man. To me, though, Zaida was much more. He was a loving, caring, accepting, and supportive grandfather. I chose to join the United States Marine Corps when I was 18 years old. Although Zaida was a famous rabbi, he had the ability to recognize what was best for me and for my future and supported my decision, regardless that it was outside the norm of what others in my family and community were doing. He truly listened to me and my needs and did not impose himself on me. While I was in boot camp, my dad, who had a good sense of humor, which he inherited from Zaida, sent me a postcard from Washington, D.C., which had a picture of the White House on it. My dad, pretending to be the president of the United States, thanked me for my service and invited me for dinner with President Bush and Laura the next time I'd be in Washington. My dad did not know that in boot camp, when mail was distributed, if a recruit received a postcard, it was read out loud in front of the entire company by the drill instructor. After reading the postcard out loud, my drill instructor took me into his office, which was an utterly terrifying experience, and asked me if this was true. He wanted to know if my family actually knew the President of the United States. I told him that my dad did not, but that maybe my grandfather did. He asked me who my grandfather was. I felt proud telling him that my grandfather was the president of Yeshiva University and knew many political figures. When I took a good look at the postcard, I realized that it was my dad's handwriting and that it was a prank. Still, my drill instructor was eager to meet my grandfather, who was planning to attend my graduation. My Zaida and grandma flew down to South Carolina for the ceremony at Paris Island. I was thrilled and proud that they came, and their pride in me made me feel really good. When I took my grandparents to see my barracks, the drill instructor excitedly introduced himself to Zaida and told him that after me, he was the second Jew who he ever met, and certainly the first rabbi he ever knew. In his civilian life, my drill instructor was studying comparative religions at Kentucky State University, so this was quite the thrill for him. I have a great photograph of the both of them talking to each other as he told Zaida that I taught him about the concept of Shabbos. My grandfather could always read people very well. He had a very good sense of the core essence of who a person was. He was not impressed by externals. It has been hard these last few years that my grandfather has not been well. I wish that as an adult I could have spent more time with him. I was really privileged, though, that my last visit with him just a week and a half ago, my grandfather was unusually alert and talkative. I was telling him all about my career as a police officer. It was incredibly touching to me that despite his illness, my grandfather was still able to see me. He did not just see my uniform, my crew cut, and my tough exterior. He was able to see the real me, with all my human frailties and vulnerabilities. He then gave me the most wonderful gift, as his last words to me were, "If you need to talk, you can call me." Zaida, how I wish now that I can call you. Thank you for being so loving and caring. You always knew exactly what to say. I love you.
My grandfather attributed his spiritual and intellectual growth to two teachers above all others, the Shnei Hamaoros HaGadolim, the two great celestial spheres as he described them in his writings. The first was his own grandfather, Rabbi Yeshua Balmel Zatzal, and the second was Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik, the Rav Zatzal. My grandfather actually had the rare privilege to deliver a eulogy for both of them, and I've returned to these two Hespedim many times in the hours since my grandfather's passing, searching for inspiration. And perhaps the most striking thing about them is that while they were delivered 44 years apart, intervening years during which my grandfather developed significantly as a thinker, he changed his mind on any number of matters. The two eulogies are astonishingly similar. And in both of them, my grandfather called particular attention to his teacher's essential, ineffable loneliness. Of the Rav, he said, he somehow did not fit into any of the conventional categories. His genius was such that the loneliness attendant upon it could not be avoided, a fact which caused him no end of emotional anguish, yet gave us the gift of his phenomenal creative originality. And compare these words to those Rabbi Lamm, at the tender age of 22, uttered about his grandfather. He said, at night, when other men slept, he pondered and created, reveling in the loneliness of his genius, and, oblivious to his immediate surroundings, would construct with a maximum of efficiency. My grandfather, so admired, was so in awe of the lonely genius, the holy warrior, expert in the parry and the thrust of the Shakla Vitaria, the Havayos, the Abayi Varava, and his chosen teachers both embodied these very qualities. And yet, in his own life, he was nothing like this at all. My grandfather was nothing like this. He was sociable, he was approachable, a convivial personality who drew friends and companions and, in other contexts, congregants and supporters like files to a lodestone. Why? Why was he so different from the teachers that he so adored? In Parshas Ba'aloscha, which we'll read next week, the Torah depicts a Moshe who had been emotionally ground down by the burdens of leadership. God therefore tasked Moshe to select 70 elders and gather them to the Mishkan, to the tabernacle, where God would grant them access to Ruach HaKodesh, the spirit of prophecy, so that they could aid Moshe. Now, the Torah tells us that unlike Moshe's enduring connection to the Almighty, the elder's gift of prophecy was only temporary. There were, however, two exceptions, men by the name of Eldad and Medad. These two, apparently an account of their righteousness, as Chazal tell us, continued to prophesy in full view of the Israelite public long after the other elders had lost their ability to do so. And word eventually reached Moshe of Eldad's and Medad's exploits. And upon hearing about this, Yehoshua, Moshe's intensely devoted student, exclaimed, Adoni Moshe Kila'im, literally, lock them away. To Yehoshua, the mere suggestion that his teacher Moshe might have peers was ludicrous, even blasphemous. Moshe, in turn, responded by gently chiding Yehoshua, Umi yitain kol am Hashem neviim. Oh, that all the Lord's people were prophets. Oh, to be among others who can relate to me, said Moshe, a smile illuminating his face. I think that as a student looking up to his teachers, my grandfather was a Yehoshua. And he correctly regarded his teachers, Rabbi Berman and Rabbi Soloveitchik, as singular, almost alien in their genius and their piety. And who else could possibly compare to them? You know, there was a moment in his eulogy for the Rav, and it's not present in the published version, in which my grandfather, remarking on Rabbi Soloveitchik's unparalleled virtuosity as a darshan, a homilist, he began to laugh, and he said, I can hardly envision the Rav calling another Rav and asking, what are you going to speak about this Yontif? Give me an idea. I mean, it was totally inconceivable to him that the Rav, that his teacher could have a peer. And of course, he was right. His teachers were lonely people. They were peerless. And that loneliness was a source of deep inspiration for them and for their students and for him in particular. But if as a student, my grandfather was a Yehoshua, then as a teacher and a leader, he was a Moshe. He never reveled in loneliness, as he wrote lovingly and admiringly about his grandfather. He gloried in companionship and seeking out others and bringing them into his inner life. And he did this particularly through two spiritual and emotional media. The first was through laughter. He certainly had a mischievous sense of humor, as do many brilliant people, but he particularly enjoyed inviting others into the experience. So just to take one example, when he was bored to tears during YU Board of Trustee meetings, he would often draw cartoon faces. He was actually an artist of prodigious talent, and some I highly suspect were caricatures of actual board members. But while most people who keep themselves entertained by doodling think nothing further of it, afterwards, my grandfather would regularly take those doodles and he'd put them in an envelope, put a stamp on them, address them, and send them out to his children and his grandchildren. He wanted us to all be in on the fun. In fact, so many of the best stories I've heard about my grandfather since his passing have involved him similarly using good humor to invite, to offer gentle guidance to others, or to diffuse potential conflict with others. And the second tactic that my grandfather used to invite people was through love. And to be sure, my grandfather's heroes were all capable of great, passionate love, but their lonely magnificence made those relationships remarkable, even unusual. So, for example, the Rav's boundless love for his wife is legendary. My grandfather spoke about their bond with inexpressible reverence during his eulogy for the Rav, but it captured the imagination, I think in part because such a relationship seemed so extraordinary for the lonely man of faith. But my grandfather's life was defined by a slew of loves. And this, I believe, sheds special light not only on his life, but actually upon his death. You know, most doctors will tell you that oftentimes patients who are terminally ill will hold on just long enough for their loved ones to say goodbye. And for someone like my grandfather, who was ailing for a very long time, this was true many times over. The first love that he held on for was 7 years ago. My Aunt Sarah, Allah Shalom, my grandfather was already ailing at the time. And we had no right as a family to expect him to be there to say goodbye to Aunt Sarah, but there he was already hanging on, even if he wasn't himself. His first, perhaps his earliest love was his brother, Rabbi Maurice Lamm Zatzal, my Uncle Maish. And these two leaders loved each other as only a Moshe and an Aaron could. And when Uncle Maish took a turn for the worse 4 years ago, my grandfather, although he was very unwell at the time, held on to make sure that he could say goodbye to his brother. Then just over a month ago, the Malach HaMaves, The angel of death came for my grandmother. But weak though he was, he lived long enough for his Eshes Chayil, his dearest companion and champion, to bid him farewell until the next world. Then, although he was deteriorating very rapidly at this point, he managed to survive long enough to say goodbye to his remaining loves, his children, his grandchildren, and even his great-grandchildren. But he still had one loved one left to whom he had not said goodbye, the truest love of his life. And that was the Torah. He gave his entire life to the Torah. He studied it. He wrote about it. He sacrificed time he could otherwise have spent with it in order to build a yeshiva so that tens, if not hundreds of thousands of future students throughout the globe and across the generations could better learn it. And he was even willing to weather the slings and arrows not only of lesser men, but of otherwise great men, all in order to teach the Torah in its fullest majesty, the way he believed it must be taught. But the tragedy was that by the end of his life, for reasons known only to the Gomel Chasadim and the Dayan Ha'emes, his body had become a prison, and his mind, once his most faithful companion, had become his jailer. So he couldn't say goodbye to the Torah in the way he would have wanted, luxuriating in its hallowed wisdom one last time. The only thing that he could do, the only option left available to him through an astounding act of sheer iron willpower and koach hanefesh, was somehow to wait until the Torah could come and say goodbye to him. And so he clung to life until Shavuos, the one day of the year when Klal Yisrael doesn't need to come to the Torah. The Torah comes down to us. And so it was that he spent his last hours on earth in the presence of his true beloved, Torasenu HaKadosha. And oh, what a day they must have spent together. And when it finally came time for the Torah to make its way back up Har Sinai into the heavens, my grandfather went with her to be received with great joy and celebration by the Almighty himself, attended by my grandfather, my Aunt Sarah, my Uncle Moshe, Rabbi Balmel, the Rav, his parents, and so many others. And Zaida, although you left us, your family, your students, your people, bereft in this world down below, we can at least attune our ears to the reverberating echoes of those last moments of ecstatic passion between you and your dearest beloved Torah. And therein we will find your legacy, a legacy that compels us to love the Torah, learn the Torah, and light the Torah as a beacon to illuminate our community, Klal Yisrael, and all of human society. May your neshama be bound up in the bonds of eternal life. Love you very much.
I never knew the magnitude of my grandfather's greatness until one day a few years ago. I was walking around the Beit Midrash in my seminary when I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. Many girls would write motivational quotes on Post-it notes and hang them up by their makom to inspire them. Around one mokum, amidst a set of quotes from some of the greatest Jewish leaders, I saw that a girl had posted an idea by Rabbi Norman Lamm. My first thought was, why is my grandfather's name on a wall? And then it hit me. Wow, Zaida is a pretty big deal. To me, Rabbi Lamm was not Rabbi Lamm, nor is he Dr. Lamm. He was simply Zaida, the one who would joke with us, draw for us, and play with us. He was the one who would take a simple blade of grass and turn it into an instrument, the one who would take a simple napkin and pen and turn it into a masterpiece. One exercise I like to do to help me recall memories is to remember a person or event through using my five senses. When doing this with memories of my Zaida, I was flooded with so much sensory input that I had to stop. I saw his kind blue eyes that always seemed like they were laughing. I heard the sound of his voice calling his grandchildren over to receive their presents during the family Hanukkah party every year. I smelled the fresh air in Sackett Lake when we would skip rocks on the nearby lake. I tasted the sweet chocolate chip cookie brittle that I would make for him because he would love to eat it. And finally, I felt his scratchy beard that I and many of my cousins would playfully pull and tug. Only about a year or two ago did I really start learning my Zaida's drushot on the Parsha on a weekly basis. It was a way I could invite my Zaida to join my family at our Shabbos table. I discovered a side of my Zaida that I never knew. The way he analyzed and darshaned the parsha was masterful. He spoke to his congregation honestly and candidly, and he did not hold back on telling them what he genuinely thought. I often wonder, how did he get away with saying that? We learn in the second Mishnah of Pirkei Avot a beautiful teaching by Shimon HaTzadik, the Mishayirei of the Knesset Hagadola. When learning the Mishnah, Zayda focuses on the word Mishayirei and connects it to the word Shirayim. He relates that there was a time when yeast was not readily available in packages as it is today, and so the baker would take the remnant of one batch of dough and use it to sour the new batch to begin fermentation. Thus, the Shirayim are those remnants which create new and healthy loaves. Zayda goes on to say that the Tzaddikim symbolize a past that is great and glorious, and they'll recreate this past glory in the present and transmits its creative leavening into the future. How true is this of Zayda? We are the Shirayim of Zayda with all his love, warmth, and devotion. I would be remiss if I did not mention my grandmother, Mendela Lamm, Zechona Livracha, and my mother, Sarah Lamm Dratch, Zechona Livracha, two wonderful, lovely, special women who have unfortunately left this world. My grandmother just weeks ago, and my mother 7 years ago, though both feel like it was yesterday. Both my grandmother and mother loved Zayda with a love so pure and with a love so fierce. From them, I learned the value of family and the importance of nurturing and cultivating those bonds. What comforts me now is that they're all there with so many others welcoming Zayda into Shemayim with open arms. I thank Hashem every day for giving me the opportunity and the honor of being Rabbi Dr. Norma Lamm's granddaughter, but most importantly, my Zayda's granddaughter.
Being a rabbi's son or daughter is a tough job. I know most of my cousins are rabbis' kids, the Millers, the Mailers, and of course the Lambs. I even married a PK. Shira's father had a pulpit for 21 years. But being a rabbi's nephew is the best job. You get all the yichus, but nowhere near the same scrutiny or responsibility. People don't quite expect the same perfection from the nephew. I lived a charmed life as the nephew of Rabbi Lamm at the Jewish Center in the 1960s and early 70s. To everyone else, he was Rabbi Lamm, but to me, he was Uncle Norman. I got away with a lot, but there was one red line. I had to sit through the sermon, often with David Shatz. My mother from across the mechitza gave me that look, and I knew I had to stay. Unwittingly, I got an education in those moments. Every week, I got a master class in language, ideas, religion, and erudition. No one before or since gave such dazzling sermons. Even better, no one cooked like my Aunt Mindy. After shul, my mother, my brothers, and I would inevitably land up at the Lambs for Shabbat lunch. I never realized how lucky I was. I was a Ben Bayit at the Lamm house at 27 West 86th Street. The Lamm kids were like siblings to me. They still are. Some of you will remember that house. It was filled with love and joy and song and generosity. Most of all, I remember the freestanding book stand, the stender, in the living room, looming like a giant stender. Open at the top of the book stand was the biggest Merriam-Webster dictionary that you could imagine. It was a beautiful bound volume that was worn with use. It was consulted constantly during meals, during Scrabble games, during conversations. We didn't need Google. We had the dictionary. The lore about my uncle was that he studied dictionaries as a young man, devouring new words and making them his own. He spent the rest of his life giving us all those words and their meaning. The generosity of my Aunt Mindy and Uncle Norman knew no bounds, and it extended well beyond my childhood and into my adulthood. When I was a senior at YU, I announced that I wanted to go to Columbia Journalism School. One Shabbat, I asked my uncle if he would read my application essay. Of course, he said, just get it to me soon so I have a few days to read it. In true adolescent fashion, the night before it was due, I showed up at his door and handed him the essay. He smiled knowingly, sat down at his desk and edited it. Okay, he rewrote it. P.S. I got in. P.S. I now teach there. Thank you, Uncle Norman. Tova, before he was your editor, he was my editor. I think about all that he did, that he and Aunt Mindy did for me back then and in the intervening years. And I'm just one person, one nephew. I multiply that by all the nephews and nieces and the cousins and the congregants and the students and the campers and the supporters and the donors and the rabbis and the ministers and the chaplains and the politicians and the physicians and lawyers and social workers and scholars, Jews and non-Jews, that he touched. As I was preparing these remarks, like the other Ari, I thought back to the great eulogies I've heard in my lifetime. And I remembered my Uncle Norman's eulogy for Max Stern in 1982. It was to a packed house at the Jewish Center. Max Stern, as many of you know, the man from Hart's Mountain, endowed Stern College for Women and many other institutions. My uncle got up and said, and this is not in the published version, but I heard this. My uncle got up and said, I cannot imagine a world without Max Stern. He spoke eloquently about Stern's generosity and humanity. He spoke about his great acts and small acts. He even quoted Sarah, his daughter, who loved Max Stern, because Max Stern was also the candy man at the Jewish Center. I think what Rabbi Lamm was really telling us in that eulogy was that we needed to learn from the life of Max Stern and in some tangible way take his place on earth. We needed to find the philanthropist within ourselves. We needed to be generous and kind and principled and philanthropic in big ways and little ways. And I say to you today, I cannot imagine a world without Norman Lamm. And I implore you and myself to find the Norman Lamm within us, to strive to be better and more kind and more smart and more generous and more thoughtful and more giving and more Jewishly connected. For that would be the mightiest tribute to this great, great life. Tehei Nishmato Baruch.
El male rachamim, shochein b'meromim, hametzei menucha nechona, al kanefei השכינה. במעלות קדושים וטהורים, כזוהר הרקיע מזהירים. לנשמת נחום מורנו ורבנו, הרב נחום בן מאיר שמואל, שהלך לעולמו, בעבור שאנחנו מתפללים לעילוי נשמתו. בגן עדן תהי מנוחתו. לכן בעל הרחמים יסתירהו בסתר כנפיו לעולמים, ויצרור בצרור החיים את נשמתו. Adonai hu nachalato veyanu Shalom al mishkavo ונאמר אמן.
Thank you all for joining us.